So, Namaskar, everyone. Today we will have again another online teaching sessions on HIV and hepatitis co-infections, and Dr. Santosil Payne will be there to take us this lecture. And all the students are requested to listen the lecture carefully, and you can ask the questions at the end of the sessions, either in chatting box or through communicating way. Sir, it's over to you. You may kindly proceed.
Good evening, everybody. So, can we start? Am I
Yes,
audible?
please. Yes,
I'm
please. You are audible. Please.
okay. Let me share the screen then. Okay, is the screen visible to everyone?
Not yet, sir.
I have shared the screen.
Yeah, you please go to the present now, then entire screen.
Present high screen. Let me.
এটা করতে কে বলেছে তোমাকে?
Yeah, we can see the screen, sir.
Let me share the presentation.
Yeah, you can make it full screen.
Is it necessary to make the full screen, or is it
Better, sir,
visible?
because students are watching. Some of them are watching in mobile. Some of them are watching in laptop.
Okay.
So, if this screen size is better, full, then it is. You can do it from down, sir. Yeah, it's full screen
Is it
is
okay
coming.
now?
Thank you, sir. Yeah, very
Okay.
good, sir. Thank you.
Okay.
Please
Okay.
go ahead, sir.
So, can we start?
Yeah, please.
Okay. Good evening, everybody. So, today we'll be discussing HIV hepatitis co-infection. This means that a person who is infected with HIV is also suffering from some form of infective hepatitis. And by infective hepatitis, we usually mean the different viral hepatitis. And among the hepatotropic virus that cause hepatitis, we all know we have got the hepatitis A, hepatitis B, hepatitis C, hepatitis D, and hepatitis E. Now, this infective hepatitis can be acute hepatitis or it can be chronic hepatitis. Coming to acute hepatitis, the most common causes of acute hepatitis are the viral hepatitis. And hepatitis A, hepatitis B, hepatitis C, hepatitis D, and hepatitis E all can cause acute hepatitis. Now, regarding hepatitis D, it usually
Sir, I think there is a problem at your end. We are not able to hear you, sir. There may be some issues. Sir, can you hear us? Sir, there is a issue. We cannot hear you. You may. Yes, I think there is. These are some disadvantages of technical things. So just wait. I think he will rejoin. Yeah.
Dr. Biplab,
Yes, sir.
I have informed Dr. Pine. He is trying to rejoin once again.
Yeah, I think he has some problem. So we are waiting.
Mhm.
Actually, somebody has joined Shiv Shekhar Chatterjee name. I think he is not our student. This ID may
No, I
be
think he's our student of the previous batch.
okay. He's from our students.
Yes, yes.
Yeah. Actually, sir, in this training program and examination, you are also inviting the student from the previous batch who has not completed the training.
Yes, Shiv Shagar Chatterjee belongs to that category only.
Okay. Okay. That's good. So, sir, do you have any estimation how many student has confirmed till date?
Now, I need to check with Mr. Ismail and I will be able to let you know by tomorrow.
Yeah, tomorrow is a holiday. May you can
Oh,
tell me
day after tomorrow?
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's okay.
And yeah, I'll be confirming it from Mr. Ismail and I will let you know.
Yeah, actually, unfortunately, I don't know what was the reason. In Delhi, attendance was very poor.
There were three
but I lost the net
examinees.
connection.
Yeah, please, sir.
Yes.
What was the how much could you listen?
Yeah,
Can you tell me?
we have listened to you that
The
second
acute
slide,
hepatitis slide.
hepatitis slide.
Acute
So you,
hepatitis slide, Professor Pine, where you are just talking about the viral hepatitis as well as the alcoholic hepatitis
Okay,
and
okay.
other things.
So
In
apart
fact,
from
you were mentioning the hepatitis D and then it snapped off.
yeah, uh, you click on a full slide, sir. It will be better for the students.
okay.
Yeah. Thank you, sir.
So
Please continue.
apart from the viral hepatitis, we need to remember that there are other important causes of acute hepatitis. For example, alcohol. And we know that many of our HIV infected patients are also addicted to alcohol. Now, drug-induced hepatitis is a very important cause of acute hepatitis. And amongst the drugs which cause acute hepatitis, we need to remember two sets of drugs that we commonly use in our clinical practice. Number one is the anti-tubercular drugs, and number two is the antiretroviral drugs. Among the anti-tubercular drugs, you all know that rifampicin, INH, and pyrazinamide are potentially hepatotoxic drugs. And incidence of hepatotoxicity is much more in the HIV infected population compared to the normal population. So what happens when you start a patient, when you see a patient and diagnose HIV infection and find that the patient is suffering from tuberculosis, you first start anti-tubercular drugs. And after a few weeks, you find that the patient is coming with features of acute hepatitis. So you need to identify which drug is the culprit and take appropriate action. Second group of drugs that are important in our context are the antiretroviral drugs. Among the antiretroviral drugs, the NNRTI are hepatotoxic. Previously, we were using nevirapine, which is very much hepatotoxic, but we are not using nevirapine nowadays. Until recently, our preferred regimen consisted of efavirenz, and efavirenz is also a potentially hepatotoxic drug. So, when you start a patient with antiretroviral drugs, you have to be very careful whether the patient is developing features of acute hepatitis or not. Currently, we are doing away with efavirenz. Our preferred regimen now is dolutegravir. Patients who are on efavirenz, they are being shifted to dolutegravir, but still we have a lot of patients who are on efavirenz-based regimen. So the picture can be even more complicated. Suppose you have diagnosed tuberculosis in a newly diagnosed HIV patient, and You have started anti-tubercular drugs. After 2 weeks, you start the antiretroviral drugs, and then the patient comes back with features of acute hepatitis. So we have to decide which drug is the actual culprit. Sometimes it can be clinically quite difficult. Nowadays, we are using dolutegravir-based regimen. Dolutegravir is probably not that hepatotoxic, but there are concerns about hepatotoxicity of dolutegravir in population who are infected with the hepatitis B or hepatitis C virus. Our experience with dolutegravir is gathering, and we have seen patients who have been started on dolutegravir-based regimen coming back with raised transaminases after some time. So the message is, whenever you are using any drug, you have to be very careful about its side effect, and hepatotoxicity is an important side effect, especially of anti-tubercular drugs and antiretroviral drugs. Now, apart from the viral hepatitis, there can be other infections also that can cause acute liver injury. For example, there can be other infections like the dengue. In fact, just now I have one patient in my ward who is suffering from dengue hepatitis. Other viruses like herpes simplex virus or Epstein-Barr virus, cytomegalovirus, they can also produce acute hepatitis. But apart from viruses, there are some other infections which are extremely common in our country, and we have to remember them. Malaria, leptospira, and scrub, they can also produce acute hepatitis. So, whenever one of our HIV infected patients comes with features of acute hepatitis, we have to decide whether it is due to a viral hepatitis or it is due to some other infection, whether it is due to alcohol or whether it is drug induced. Now, coming to chronic hepatitis, or commonly we use the term chronic liver disease, or in advanced stage we use cirrhosis of liver. The infections that can cause chronic liver disease are usually hepatitis B and hepatitis C infection. But apart from them, again, alcohol is an important cause of chronic liver disease. In fact, most of my male patients who are admitted in my ward with decompensated chronic liver disease, the etiology in them is alcohol. Another important etiology, especially nowadays, is NASH, or non-alcoholic steatohepatitis, seen in patients who have diabetes or features of metabolic syndrome. So, we can have a patient who is HIV infected and also co-infected with hepatitis B, or we have a patient with HIV hepatitis C co-infection, or we can have a patient with HIV who is infected with both hepatitis B and hepatitis C virus. And some of them will be also addicted to alcohol, and some of them may be having diabetes or features of metabolic syndrome. So the picture can be quite complicated. Coming to viral hepatitis A, we'll briefly discuss this. Our main focus of discussion today will be on hepatitis B and hepatitis C. Now, viral hepatitis A, you all know, is transmitted by the fecal oral route, that means contaminated food and water. The incubation period is 15 to 45 days. Now, regarding the clinical presentation, all these viral hepatitis, when they produce acute hepatitis, they have more or less similar clinical picture. Initially, there is a prodromal phase that lasts for about 1 to 2 weeks. In the prodromal phase, the patients usually have fever, malaise, body ache, joint pain, headache. And this prodromal phase is, after this prodromal phase, the fever goes off and the patient's urine becomes deep yellow, the eyes become yellow. That means the patient now becomes jaundiced. Now this jaundice deepens, and when the jaundice deepens, in the meantime, the patient's appetite recovers. Anorexia is a very, very important clinical feature in the prodromal phase. So the jaundice deepens, the patient appetite recovers, and after sometimes, maybe after 1 to 2 months, the jaundice also disappears. So this is usually the clinical picture: the prodromal phase, the icteric phase, and then the convalescent phase. All these viral hepatitis are self-limiting infections. Rarely, less than 1%, they will produce a fulminant hepatitis. Viral hepatitis A does not produce any chronicity. It just produces acute hepatitis infection. Diagnosis is by detecting the IgM hepatitis anti-hepatitis A antibodies, which is usually detectable 5 to 10 before the symptoms, and it may persist for up to 6 months. After 6 months, it is the IgG anti-hepatitis A antibody which is detectable. Now, the treatment is usually symptomatic. For prevention, we have got an vaccine. So, any patient who is suffering from any form of chronic liver disease and who has not been infected with hepatitis A in the past, that means he is not immune to hepatitis A, should have this vaccination. Coming to hepatitis E, it is a single-stranded RNA virus. In fact, apart from the hepatitis B, all these viruses are RNA virus. Just like hepatitis A, it is transmitted by the fecal oral route. Incubation period is 2 to 10 weeks. Clinical features, just like other acute viral hepatitis, usually asymptomatic or mild anicteric illness in children. The importance of viral hepatitis E lays in the fact that it can produce a severe form of hepatitis in pregnancy. If it affects the pregnant mother, especially in the third trimester, it can have a mortality rate even up to 20 to 30%. The diagnosis is by anti-IgM hepatitis E virus antibody. Regarding vaccine against viral hepatitis E, in our country, we do not have any such vaccine. Actually, one vaccine is available. It has been produced and it is available only in China. It is not FDA approved and it is not available in other countries. Now, coming to hepatitis B, which is the main focus of our discussion. As you can see, this is some statistical data. Indian estimate is about 40 million, and you can see that India falls in the intermediate zone of prevalence. Globally, about 257 million people are chronically infected with hepatitis B virus, and so this is a real problem. In India, chronic hepatitis B affects around 2 to 8% of PLHIV, but this is widely variable. Data from different parts of the country have different range. Global prevalence is around 7.4%. Now, this is a DNA virus. The incubation period is about 30 to 180 days. Regarding mode of transmission, the mode of transmission is just like HIV. Perinatal and horizontal transmission in early life, and other modes of transmission are the sexual and by percutaneous route. That means by contaminated blood or blood products or from contaminated needles. Now, a few words about this mode of transmission. In regions of the world where the transmission rate is high, this includes the Southeast Asian country and even in our country, most of the hepatitis B infections occur early in life, either in the perinatal stage from mother to child transmission or by horizontal transmission in the early infancy. Now, what happens when infection occurs at such an early age? There is no acute hepatitis, but the infection becomes chronic. Around 90% of these infections, they become chronic infections. We'll see later that this is called a phase of immune tolerance. Now, when this child grows, reaches adolescence or early adulthood, this tolerance is partially lost. And then there is a flare of this underlying chronic infection in the form of acute hepatitis. So when you see an adolescent or adult patient who was presented with features of acute hepatitis B, in fact, he may not be having actually acute hepatitis infection. What you are seeing is a flare of underlying chronic hepatitis B infection. On the other hand, When this infection occurs in an older child or in adult life, either by the sexual or by the percutaneous route, patients usually have acute hepatitis and clear the virus. Only in less than 5% of the patients, chronicity sets in. So, in early life, in infancy, it is chronic infection, not acute hepatitis, while infection in adult life, it is acute hepatitis and not chronic infection. However, if the patient is HIV infected, then the chance of chronicity is much increased. Regarding the course of hepatitis B infection, the course is variable. Now, acute infection is mostly subclinical or anicteric. That means without producing jaundice. There will be just transaminitis in 70% of the cases. In 30% of the cases, there will be jaundice. Fulminant infection again is rare in less than 1% of the population infected with this virus. Regarding chronic hepatitis B infection, patients may be asymptomatic carrier, or they can have chronic hepatitis, or they may have cirrhosis, or they may have HCC. And the patient can present to you in any stage of the illness. For example, the patient can present with HCC and you find that the patient is HbSAg positive, hepatitis B infection is diagnosed the first time. Or the patient may be an asymptomatic carrier. A pregnant mother during routine checkup is found to be hepatitis B surface antigen positive. Now, these viral hepatitis are basically systemic infections, but the virus replicates in the liver and the brunt of injury is on the hepatocytes. So some extrahepatic manifestations may also be seen in hepatitis B infection. In acute infection, you can have serum sickness-like syndrome. In chronic infection, you can have glomerulonephritis, sometimes nephrotic syndrome, or polyarthritis nodosa, polyarthritis, some skin lesions, but we're not going to discuss this. These are not very important. Now, there are certain markers of hepatitis B infections. You need to know these markers and you need to properly interpret this marker. Coming to acute hepatitis B, when a person is first time infected with hepatitis B virus, the first marker that appears in the serum is hepatitis B surface antigen. Hepatitis B surface antigen usually occurs about 1 to 12 weeks after the acute infection, usually around 8 weeks. And it precedes the development of jaundice and it precedes the development of rise in transaminases. So after the infection, first to appear is the hepatitis B surface antigen. This is followed by rise in the aminotransferases, that is the SGPT and SGOT. And then the patients become symptomatic and develops jaundice. This hepatitis B surface antigen is present throughout the course of the clinical illness and also beyond that. Usually it disappears 1 to 2 months after the appearance of jaundice. After hepatitis B surface antigen disappears, antibody against hepatitis B surface antigen is detectable, that is the anti-HBs, and this is the protective antibody. Now, the other marker which appears along with hepatitis B surface antigen is the hepatitis B core antibody. Now, hepatitis B core antigen is not detectable in the serum. 2 to 6 weeks after the appearance of hepatitis B surface antigen, the anti-hepatitis B core antibody or anti-HBC is detectable in the serum. Initially, it is IgM anti-HBC, and later on, after 6 months, the predominant antibody is IgG anti-HBC. Now, the presence of IgM anti-HBC therefore denotes acute infection, whereas absence of IgM anti-HBC, presence of IgG anti-HBC denotes infection sometimes in the past. So, a patient who is HbSAg positive, but the duration of infection is unknown, testing for IgM anti-HBC and IgG anti-HBC is helpful in determining whether it is an acute infection or it is a past infection. Now, other marker that appears almost along with hepatitis B surface antigen or just 1 to 2 weeks after hepatitis B surface antigen appears is the hepatitis B E antigen. Now, hepatitis B antigen is usually a marker of viral replication. However, in acute hepatitis, this hepatitis B E antigen is usually short-lived and it disappears shortly after the peak in the transaminases. After hepatitis B E antigen disappears, antibody against hepatitis B E antigen, that is anti-HBe, appears and persists. Now, in contrast, look at the chronic hepatitis B. Here, the hepatitis B surface antigen persists beyond 6 months. The hepatitis core antibody is usually IgG type. The hepatitis B surface antibody is usually absent, or if present, it is present in low titer. In early phase of chronic hepatitis B infection, there is hepatitis B virus DNA and hepatitis E antigen, both of them are detectable. And actually the presence of hepatitis B E antigen and hepatitis HBV DNA, they mark the replicative phase of viral infection. Hepatitis B E antigen is a qualitative marker and hepatitis B HBV DNA is a quantitative marker of viral replication. With passage of time, however, this hepatitis B this phase of viral replication gives way to a relatively non-replicative phase of viral replication. At this point of time, the hepatitis B E antigen disappears and antibody against hepatitis B antigen, that is anti-HBe, appears. HBV DNA levels also goes down. And this is usually associated, this seroconversion is usually associated with a transient acute hepatitis picture with rise in transaminases. Occasionally, this non-replicative phase can again revert back to a replicative phase. Again, the HBV DNA level rises. The HBe antigen may or may not be present. And sometimes the IgM hepatitis B core antibody, which I have said that is a marker of acute infection, it may also reappear during an acute flare of chronic hepatitis B infection. Now, chronic hepatitis B usually has 4 phases. The immune tolerant phase, which is nowadays called hepatitis B E antigen, chronic hepatitis B E antigen positive chronic hepatitis B infection. Then the immune active phase, it is the hepatitis B E antigen positive chronic hepatitis. Inactive phase, it is the hepatitis B E antigen hepatitis B chronic infection. And the reactivation phase, that is the E antigen negative hepatitis. And finally, we may have a phase where the hepatitis B surface antigen is lost. Now, in the immune tolerant phase, this is usually seen, which I've already discussed, when the infection is acquired in early stage of life. The hepatitis B E antigen is positive. The HBV DNA is very high, but the ALT, which is a marker of hepatic inflammation, the ALT is normal. And if we do a liver biopsy, which is usually not done, we'll find that the liver biopsy is normal or there is only mild inflammation. Whereas in the immune active phase, the HBV DNA is raised, the E antigen positive, but the ALT is increased, which is a marker of, again, active liver inflammation. And if a liver biopsy is done, it will show active inflammation on the biopsy. Now, the inactive phase, the E antigen becomes negative and the antibody against hepatitis B E antigen becomes positive. the ALT is normal, the HBV DNA is low, less than 2000 IU per ml, and there is minimal inflammation on liver biopsy. These are usually what we call chronic asymptomatic carriers. Again, in the immune escape or reactivation phase, the hepatitis B E antigen is usually negative because of some mutation. Anti-HB is positive, ALT is raised, or it could be fluctuating. HBV DNA is again increased, again HBV DNA may be fluctuating. Inflammation on histology is there is active inflammation if we do a liver biopsy. So we have to understand these phases because the management of different phase is different. What is the impact of HIV on the course of hepatitis B virus? There is increased rate of chronicity to the tune of 20 to 40%, whereas an immunocompetent person after an acute B virus infection, the chronicity is less than 5%. There is rapid fibrosis, more rapid progression to cirrhosis, there is increased hepatic decompensation and increased incidence of hepatocellular carcinoma in hepatitis B co-infection. And there is increased liver-related and overall mortality rates. What is the impact of hepatitis B virus on HIV? Probably the impact of hepatitis B virus on HIV replication is not that significant, and probably hepatitis B virus does not have much impact on ART-mediated viral suppression or CD4 rise. Now, HIV co-infection is associated with more frequent flares of hepatic transaminases due to either iris or interruption of treatment or development of resistance or spontaneously, and there is increased rate of ART toxicity. Now we need to understand this. Suppose you have got a patient HIV hepatitis B co-infection, you have started antiretroviral therapy. Our preferred regimen nowadays, you all know, is tenofovir, lamivudine, dolutegravir. Of this, tenofovir and lamivudine also have potent anti-HBV activity. And after some time, maybe after 6 weeks, the patient comes with features of acute hepatitis with rise in the transaminases. What can be the cause of this acute hepatitis? Now you all know, because of the use of ART, there can be immune reconstitution. And because of this immune reconstitution, there can be a flare of underlying chronic hepatitis B, and the patient can develop acute hepatitis. Again, as we have already discussed, that there may be spontaneous or drug-induced seroconversion. That means the patient was hepatitis B E antigen positive. After starting treatment, the patient has become E antigen negative and hepatitis B E antibody positive. And as we have discussed before, this seroconversion is usually associated with rise in transaminases and acute hepatitis-like picture. So it can be due to immune reconstitution, or it can be due to seroconversion. This seroconversion may be spontaneous, or this seroconversion may be because of the effect of the tenofovir and lamivudine, which have potent anti-HBV activity. Or it may be that there has been interruption of the antiretroviral therapy. Either the patient has stopped the drug himself or herself, or due to some reason you have stopped the antiretroviral therapy. Now, if you suddenly stop this antiretroviral therapy, you have also stopped the therapy against hepatitis B virus. And this can also result in acute hepatitis-like flare. Again, a patient who is getting ART for some duration, the virus HIV can develop resistance to the antiretroviral regimen. As a result of this, the patient can again have a flare of hepatitis B virus infection. And as we have discussed, drug toxicity should always be kept in mind whenever a patient comes with features of acute hepatitis. And these patients are more susceptible to develop ART-induced toxicity. So all these can be the cause of acute hepatitis like picture when you start antiretroviral therapy with tenofovir, lamivudine, dolutegravir in a patient who is co-infected with hepatitis B virus. It is important that you actually diagnose what is the exact cause of this acute hepatitis, because the treatment will vary. If it is due to ART toxicity, then definitely you have to withdraw, you have to stop the antiretroviral therapy and take appropriate measures. If it is due to immune reconstitution, most of the which will be characterized by raise in the CD4 count and a drop in the HIV RNA level, RNA viral load, then most of the time it is a self-limiting and you can carefully monitor the patient and continue the drug. You should always try to avoid sudden interruption of HIV HBV treatment. If you have to stop the antiretroviral drugs due to some reason, you must use another drug which is effective against hepatitis B. This we'll discuss again later. Now coming to clinical evaluation for hepatitis B virus infection. In fact, this is the clinical evaluation for all patients with chronic liver disease. You look for jaundice, conjunctival hemorrhages, anemia, spider angioma, palmar erythema, spontaneous bruising, petechiae, palpable purpura, clubbing, testicular atrophy, parotid enlargement, asterixis, lymphadenopathy, caput medusae, ascites. All these things you have to look for in a patient who presents with features of chronic liver disease. So how do you remember this? Simply, you must remember what we have learned in our MBBS classes, the history taking and the general survey. The general survey is very, very important in a patient with chronic liver disease. So when we do the general, when you first take the history and we do the general survey, the first thing that we look for is the patient's level of consciousness, whether the patient is conscious, alert, and cooperative. If your patient is not that conscious, not that alert, then you must think whether the patient is having features of hepatic encephalopathy or not. And if you think that the patient is having features of hepatic encephalopathy, then you look for the flapping tremor. After that, you look at the patient's build and the nutrition. Most of these chronic liver disease patients are malnourished. But please remember that when we analyze malnutrition in an adult patient, we usually check the body mass index. However, in a patient of chronic liver disease who has got a big ascites, the BMI is not an ideal indicator because of the ascites, the patient's body weight will be increased and the BMI may be falsely normal. So you should look for other indicators of malnutrition. For example, look at the muscle bulk, mid upper arm circumference, the skin fold thickness, and other markers of malnutrition. Then you look at the faces. Sometimes we say the hepatic faces, a sallow complexion, presence of jaundice, and in alcoholic patients, sometimes you can get bilateral parotid enlargement. Then you look for the presence of anemia, cyanosis, jaundice, edema, clubbing. Anemia is quite common, anemia of chronic disease, or the patient may have bled from the varices. Cyanosis is rare, but it is possible because rarely there may be opening up of arteriovenous shunts in the pulmonary circulation and there can be cyanosis, but it is extremely rare. Jaundice, obviously, you have to look for jaundice in all patients with liver disease. Edema, yes, chronic liver disease patients, they have pedal edema, it is quite common. Clubbing is uncommon, but clubbing may be seen in primary biliary cirrhosis. Again, primary biliary cirrhosis is not a common condition in our country. Then you look at the skin conditions. This is very, very important. Look at the patient's hand. Look for palmar erythema. Look at the patient's nail. Look for white nails or koilonychia. Look at the skin. Look for spider nevi. Look for any petegy, any bruises. Look for gynecomastia. Look for loss of axillary and pubic hair. Look at the testis, whether there is testicular atrophy or not. Then look at the abdomen. Look for the abdominal distensions, the presence of ascites. Check by looking for the fluid thrill and shifting dullness. Look for the prominent dilated tortuous abdominal veins. Palpate the liver, palpate the spleen. Splenomegaly usually is present and denotes portal hypertension. The liver may or may not be palpable. We all know that in cirrhosis, the liver is shrunken. Sometimes a shrunken but firm liver may be palpable in the upper epigastrium. In patients who are alcoholic and have alcohol-related chronic liver disease, you can have an enlarged liver. In hepatocellular carcinoma, also you can have a enlarged hard nodular liver. So that is how you go about examining a patient who has come with features of liver disease. Now coming to the laboratory evolution hepatitis B virus infections, again this is actually the laboratory evolution for any patient with liver disease. You check the LFT, prothrombin time, hemogram, abdominal ultrasound, check for the alpha fetoprotein in special populations, and do an upper GI endoscopy in patients with CLD. Now LFT is very important. You need to know the parameters that we check in an LFT and how to interpret them. So in an LFT, we look at the bilirubin, we look at the liver enzymes, the transaminases, SGPT, SGOT or ALT, AST that we call nowadays, and the alkaline phosphatase, and we look at the serum albumin. Now bilirubin will be increased in jaundice, but please remember, whenever you see a report of raised bilirubin, check, is it the direct fraction, that is the conjugated bilirubin, or it is the unconjugated bilirubin that is raised? If it is just unconjugated hyperbilirubinemia, then it is either hemolytic jaundice, Gilbert syndrome, or more importantly in our context, the patient is taking atazanavir ritonavir. This does not signify presence of liver disease. But however, if the patient is having conjugated hyperbilirubinemia, it could be due to either hepatocellular dysfunction or it could be due to cholestasis or obstruction. This cholestasis can be intrahepatic or it can be extrahepatic. If it is extrahepatic cholestasis, then there is usually a surgical course for the jaundice. Now coming to the transaminases, the SGPT and SGOT, they are usually raised in hepatocellular dysfunction. SGPT is more liver specific. In acute hepatitis, these enzymes are very much raised. In viral hepatitis and drug-induced hepatitis, these enzymes may be raised more than 10 times. In viral hepatitis, the SGPT is often raised more than 1,000. So if you get an SGPT more than 1,000, it is either a viral hepatitis or a drug or toxin-mediated hepatitis, or rarely it could be ischemic hepatitis. In alcoholic hepatitis, it usually does not cross the value of 200. So SGPT, SGOT levels, they are very important markers of acute hepatitis. Whereas raised alkaline phosphatase means there is some form of cholestasis or obstructive pattern of jaundice. In drug-induced toxicity, it can be SGPT may be raised or the alkaline phosphatase may be raised or both can be raised. Now what happens in chronic liver disease or cirrhosis of liver? The liver transaminases, the SGPT, SGOT, they are not much raised. They may be quite normal. And in fact, when cirrhosis develops, it is SGOT which is more raised than SGPT. In fact, when we suspect cirrhosis, we look at the SGPT and SGOT and see whether the SGOT value is more than SGPT. Other situation where the SGOT may be more than SGPT is in patients with alcoholic hepatitis. Alcoholic hepatitis patients usually have an SGOT 2 times or 3 times more than SGPT values. So in cirrhosis of liver, SGPT or SGOT are not that much helpful in diagnosis of hepatocellular dysfunction. Now the other important thing that you look at is the serum albumin. In chronic liver disease, the serum albumin is low. However, in acute hepatitis, in the acute stage, the serum albumin is usually normal. Coming to prothrombin time and INR. The prothrombin time gives a very good picture of hepatic function, just like albumin. But albumin, what happens with albumin? Albumin takes some time to decrease. So in acute hepatitis, in the initial phase, the albumin level is normal. However, prothrombin time, this is altered very quickly. So in acute hepatitis, if you get a raised prothrombin time, this means there has been significant liver damage, and this is a serious form of acute hepatitis. Please remember, it is not the absolute value of the transaminase that determines the severity of acute hepatitis. Neither it is the absolute value of bilirubin. Unless the bilirubin is very high, more than 20, that signifies the severity of acute hepatitis. But if you get a raised prothrombin time in a patient with acute hepatitis, then it denotes that it is a severe hepatitis. What happens in cirrhosis? The prothrombin time can be increased because of hepatocellular failure. But again, you must remember that prothrombin time is actually determined by the level of prothrombotic and antithrombotic factors, procoagulants, anticoagulant factors synthesized by the liver. So sometimes the prothrombin time may be normal in cirrhosis of liver also. But a raised prothrombin time definitely signifies that the liver disease is advanced. Complete hemogram. As I have already said, anemia is quite common in chronic liver disease. Look at the platelet count. Platelet count is quite important. Thrombocytopenia often signifies the presence of cirrhosis. So again, when you suspect cirrhosis, we look at the thrombocyte count. If the platelet count is low, this is often a marker. This is an indirect marker of cirrhosis. Abdominal ultrasound, usually we can look at the hepatic echo texture. We can look at the presence look for the portal vein. The diameter of the portal vein gives an idea of the portal hypertension. We can look for the collaterals by doing the Doppler. We can look for splenomegaly if it is not palpable clinically because of the ascites. And we can diagnose ascites. If the ascites is very minimal, clinically not diagnosable, ultrasound is a very good method for picking up ascites, and then can do the ultrasound guided ascitic fluid aspiration at that time. Now, ultrasound is also very useful in chronic liver disease. In most patients with cirrhosis, usually every 6 monthly ultrasound is done to look for the development, whether the patient is developing hepatocellular carcinoma or not. Alpha fetoprotein, when you suspect HCC, we check for the alpha fetoprotein. Upper GI endoscopy is basically for checking whether the patient has esophageal varices or not. Now, regarding evaluation of liver fibrosis, the gold standard is liver biopsy. But nowadays, we do not like to do liver biopsy. It is an invasive procedure, and many of the patients, they have coagulopathies, raised prothrombin time. So liver biopsy is not usually done nowadays for the diagnosis of liver fibrosis. Cirrhosis is usually diagnosed clinically, and we have got some non-invasive tests. For example, we measure the liver stiffness. We can do the FibroScan. FibroScan is available in our hospital. We are doing routinely FibroScan. And according to our national guideline, a FibroScan KPA value of 8 signifies significant fibrosis, and a value above 11 is taken as the indirect marker of presence of cirrhosis. APRI is another scoring system. FIB4 is another scoring system. APRI is basically AST platelet ratio index. You look at the AST and look at the platelet. Nowadays, calculators are available. So you just put the values and you get the value of the APRI. And again, an APRI more than 1.5 denotes significant fibrosis. APRI greater than 2 is taken as cirrhosis according to our National Hepatitis Control Program guideline. Now coming to the indications for treatment in chronic hepatitis B. Now this can be a little bit complicated because all patients with hepatitis B infection, chronic hepatitis B infection, may not require treatment. As we have said before, patients who are in the immune tolerant phase, patients who are inactive carriers, they do not require treatment, whereas patients who have features of active hepatitis, they must be treated with potent antiviral drugs. So how to decide who requires treatment and who does not require? Actually, you have to take into account the patient's HBV DNA level, the hepatitis B e antigen status, the ALT value, which is the marker of inflammation, and you have to make an assessment of the degree of fibrosis, and this is usually assessed by non-invasive methods like the FibroScan or the APRI scoring that we have just discussed, and then you decide whether the patient requires treatment or not. To summarize, according to our National Hepatitis B Control Program, all adults, adolescent, children, and CHB with clinical evidence of compensated or decompensated cirrhosis or APRI score greater than 2 should be treated regardless of ALT, hepatitis B e antigen status, HBV DNA levels. That means chronic hepatitis B patient has cirrhosis, treat. Treatment is recommended for adults with chronic hepatitis B who do not have clinical evidence of cirrhosis or based on APRI score less than equal to 2 in adults, but are aged more than 30 years, persistently elevated ALT levels, and high level of HBV replication, HBV DNA greater than 20,000, regardless of the hepatitis B e antigen status, they must also be treated. So there are different algorithms, different countries, they have their different guidelines, and according to that we'll decide. But in our situation, when we have a HIV hepatitis B co-infected patient, the decision making is not difficult. All our patients should be treated for chronic hepatitis B. And so we have to select an antiretroviral regimen in such a way that it should include at least two drugs which have also potent activity against hepatitis B. And we all know that our preferred regimen nowadays is tenofovir, lamivudine, dolutegravir, and of this tenofovir and lamivudine, they have potent anti-hepatitis B activity. So what are the drugs which are active against hepatitis B virus? Previously, we were using interferon, but nowadays we have shifted to mainly oral drugs. The potent drugs are the tenofovir disoproxil fumarate or TDF, which is available in our program. We have got the TAF, tenofovir alafenamide, which can be used in patient with renal dysfunction, but TAF is not available in our program. Entecavir is also a potent drug. Lamivudine is moderately highly potent, which is again available in our program. Impricitabine is similar to lamivudine. Telvivudine and adibovir are the other groups of drug. Now, what are the principles of ART in HIV hepatitis B co-infection? As I have said before, we have to select a regimen and we must have two drugs which are active against hepatitis B virus also. Lamivudine should not be used as a single agent, as HBV resistance develops 50% by 2 years and 90% by 4 years. 3TC and FTC are equivalent. Lamivudine and emtricitabine are equivalent. TDF 3TC backbone to be continued in second-line ART regimen in addition to appropriate ART regimen if HBV DNA is suppressed. This is again very, very important. Suppose we have started treating a patient with tenofovir, lamivudine, efavirenz. and the patient is also co-infected with hepatitis B. And in passage of time, the HIV develops resistance to this first line regimen TLE. So our second line regimen will be zidovudine, lamivudine, dolutegravir. However, in this case, we should also continue with the tenofovir for its anti-HBV activity. So in the second line, the patient will be getting zidovudine, lamivudine, dolutegravir, and also tenofovir. So whenever a patient is having TL-based first-line regimen and you are going to change that to a non-TL based regimen, always check for the hepatitis B surface antigen status of the patient. Even if he has proved to be HBsAg negative in the past, at the time of changing the regimen, again check for the HBsAg and status of the patient. Now, when TDF is substituted with AZT or abacavir due to toxicity, another active agent like entecavir has to be added to the ARV regimen for potent suppression of HBV DNA. Again, this is very, very important. You have started treating the patient with tenofovir, lamivudine, dolutegravir, or tenofovir, lamivudine, efavirenz. After some times, we all know that tenofovir can have renotoxicity in the form of tubular dysfunction, Fanconi-like syndrome. So the patient develops TDF toxicity. So you have to substitute tenofovir with either zidovudine or abacavir. You cannot use TDF anymore. In these cases, you have to use another potent drug with anti-HBV action. So what you do is that instead of TLE, maybe you are using now ZLE, but you add entecavir as another drug for the hepatitis B virus infection. So your regimen will be ZLE plus entecavir. Sudden withdrawal of HBV active agents to be avoided to reduce the incidence of flare. Again, this is very important. Suddenly do not stop the ART in a patient who is HBV co-infected, because this can cause a flare of acute hepatitis, which we have already discussed. If you have to do it, we need to add entecavir. Again, this is a very difficult clinical situation. Hepatic flares typically present as an unexpected increase in ALT/AST level more than 5 times the upper time of normal, and symptoms of clinical hepatitis: fatigue, nausea, abdominal pain, jaundice within 6 to 12 weeks of commencing ART. Differential diagnosis is drug-induced toxicity, which we have already discussed. We have discussed this before. So the bottom line is, you start antiretroviral therapy, you check the aminotransferase level periodically every 6 to 8 weeks at least initially. Dose of TAF has to be reduced, adjusted with tenofovir cobicistat, but TAF is not available in our program, so we are not usually using it. Regarding treatment success, this regimen is very, very effective in suppressing both HIV and hepatitis B. Our regimen of TLE or TLD is a very, very effective regimen. This treatment strategy has achieved high rates of HBV DNA suppression, 90%, with hepatitis B E antigen loss 46%, and surface antigen loss to the tune of even 12% in E antigen positive patients after 5 years of treatment without evidence of resistance. Resistance to tenofovir is not known yet. Reduced progression to cirrhosis with no significant differences in the response to those with or without HIV co-infection. Till date, no viral resistance to tenofovir. If ARVs need to be changed because of HIV drug resistance or some drug toxicity, then tenofovir and lamivudine should be continued together with the new ARV drugs unless TDF is specifically contraindicated due to its toxicity. In that case, we will be using entecavir. Now, this is a scoring system which we use in patients with chronic liver disease. I think many of you are familiar with it. This is the child book scoring system. We look for the encephalopathy, presence of ascites, albumin level, the bilirubin level, and the prothrombin time. And we give points 1, 2, 3 depending upon the severity. And finally, we grade the patients as child book class A, class B or class C. The class B and class C are the patients who have decompensated chronic liver disease, and actually these are the patients who are candidate for liver transplantation. Now, ART in liver disease, again, this is a problem. Which regimen should we choose in a patient who has got chronic liver disease? Sometimes this can be a very, very big clinical problem. Now, abacavir is contraindicated in child POOC B and C. It can be used in child POOC A in dose of 200 milligram BD, but we do not have this 200 milligram tablet in our program. NNRTIs like nevirapine, efavirenz are contraindicated in child POOC B and C. We are not using nevirapine. Efavirenz is also gradually being phased off, although we have a large number of patients still on efavirenz. ATVR is not recommended in hepatic impairment. Unboosted atazanavir can be used in child B, 300 milligram OD. Again, we are not using unboosted ATV in our program. LPVR can be used with caution in liver impairment, but again, this can also cause transaminitis. Darunavir, ritonavir, boosted darunavir, ritonavir can be used in mild to moderate liver disease, but should be avoided in severe liver damage. Iron STIs were using dolutegravir. Now, dolutegravir is also contraindicated in child POOC C. So, if a patient has a decompensated liver disease, it is really very, very difficult to find, it is very challenging to find an appropriate antiretroviral regimen for these patients. Now, regarding prevention of hepatitis B virus infection, the NACO technical guidelines say that all persons newly diagnosed with HIV should be screened for surface antigen, immunized if not infected. The problem is that we all know that patients who are immunosuppressed, the magnitude and duration of immune response is much, much reduced. Now, who are the candidates for vaccination? All patients do not require vaccination. Some of them may be already immune to hepatitis B. Nowadays, hepatitis B vaccination is incorporated as a part of universal immunization program, but many of the adult patients have not received the vaccine in the past. So you have to first find out whether the patient requires vaccination or not, whether he is already immune to hepatitis B or not. For that, ideally, you should check for the hepatitis B surface antigen, hepatitis B surface antibody, and hepatitis B core antibody. If the patient is hepatitis B surface antigen negative, the hepatitis B surface antibody is positive in high titer, then the patient is already immune and he does not require vaccination. If the patient is hepatitis B surface antigen positive, then he is suffering from chronic infection. He also does not require vaccination, he needs treatment. If the patient is hepatitis B surface antigen negative, HBs negative, hepatitis B core antibody negative, then the patient is not immune and this patient should be vaccinated. So patients without chronic HBV infection and without immunity to HBV, anti-HBs less than 10, they should be vaccinated. Now, an unusual situation may arise where the patients have only isolated anti-HBC. Most of these patients, they had hepatitis B infection in the past and the HbS level has probably waned off. Or the anti-HBC can be a false positive also. What you do in this situation is that you give one standard dose of the vaccine and after 1 to 2 months, check the anti-HbS. If the anti-HbS titer is more than 100, then no vaccination is needed. But if it is less than 100, then a complete series of vaccination should be given. Early vaccination is recommended before CD4 count falls below 350, as low CD4 count at time of vaccination has been associated with poor response to vaccine. However, in a patient with low baseline CD4 count, vaccination should not be deferred until the CD4 is greater than 350. In some patients with CD4 less than 200, do respond to vaccination. So you vaccinate the patient, check for the antibody titer. If the patient HbS titer is not that more than 10, that means the patient has not responded. In such situation, some would start the antiretroviral therapy, wait for the CD4 count to increase, and then again revaccinate the patient. So what are the vaccination schedule? Now you all know that in an immunocompetent adult, the usual vaccination schedule which we all have taken, is a standard dose of a recombinant vaccine like Engerix B given at 0, 1, and 6 months. But what should be the vaccination schedule in a patient who is suffering from HIV? As you can see, there are different vaccination schedules. This means that there is no clear-cut guideline which vaccination schedule should be used in a patient who is immunocompromised. So you can use the standard schedule at 0, 1, 6 months, or you can use a double dose at 0, 1, 2, 6 months. Combined hepatitis A and hepatitis B vaccine can be used. There is a new adjuvanted vaccine which can be given in 2 doses, but it has not been tried in immunocompromised population. It is not probably available in India. However, what you should remember that anti-HBs should be obtained 1 to 2 months after completion of the vaccine. Patients with anti-HBs less than 10 will be considered as non-responders. And for non-responders, you again revaccinate with a second dose of vaccine series. Some experts might delay revaccination until a sustained increase in CD4 count with ART has occurred. The alternative vaccine dose and duration for vaccine non-responders can be a double dose, 4-dose series of hepatitis B vaccine. Now this is important. The prevention of hepatitis B infection in a newborn when the mother is HBsAg positive. In the newborn, the hepatitis B vaccine should be given within 12 hours of birth as soon as possible. This is the dose 0 followed by a standard hepatitis B vaccine. Hepatitis B immunoglobulin 0.5 ml IM should be given immediately at birth. And mother, of course, should be on tenofovir lamivudine based regimen during the pregnancy. Now coming to HIV and hepatitis C. This is the statistics global estimate of hepatitis C in 2018. Indian estimate is 6 to 12 million. Global estimate of HIV-HCV co-infection is around 2.3 million. 5 to 15% of people living with HIV are co-infected with HCV. 67% among people who inject drugs. So this is the major risk groups, the IDUs. Most of our HCV patients, HIV-HCV co-infected patients are IDUs. It is most efficiently transmitted through blood and blood products. Vertical and perinatal transmission can occur, but it is low. However, in HIV-infected population, the vertical and perinatal transmission is increased. In a non-HIV population, if the mother is HCV RNA positive, the chance of transmission is 4 to 7% in the newborn. Whereas if the mother is HIV infected, then the chance of transmission is to the tune of 10 to 20%. Similarly, sexual transmission is also inefficient in immunocompetent individuals, but sexual transmission is increased in patients who are HIV co-infected. Common in IDU and hemophilic and thalassaemic. Another group of population who are susceptible are those who are undergoing routine hemodialysis. Now, this is the natural history of hepatitis C virus infection. After an acute hepatitis C virus infection, there will be spontaneous resolution in 15 to 40%, but in the majority, there will be chronic infections. So after an acute hepatitis B infection in an adult, majority clears, chronicity is less, but in case of acute hepatitis C virus, after an acute hepatitis C, it is a chronicity is much more. So hepatitis C is basically a chronic infection. Of this chronic infection, some of them will go to cirrhosis. A thumb rule is that after 20 years, 20% of them will develop cirrhosis. And some of them, about 70%, 75%, it will slowly progressive. Others will develop hepatocellular carcinoma and liver failure. So chronic HCV infection is a very important cause of decompensated chronic liver disease and hepatocellular carcinoma. What is the impact on HIV on HCV infection? Just like hepatitis B, HIV accelerates HCV-related liver disease progression, increased liver fibrosis progression, increased rate of liver decompensation, cirrhosis, hepatocellular carcinoma and liver-related mortality, increased incidence of hepatotoxicity of ART. So HIV has a profound adverse effect on both hepatitis B and hepatitis C infection. All HIV infected patients should be screened for HCV. You should test for routinely for HCV antibody using the third generation validated ELISA. If the ELISA is positive, that means HCV antibody is positive, you check for the HCV RNA and genotype. In our national program, we are just looking at the HCV RNA. Genotypic facility is not there. False negative ELISA in the window period and in blunted immune response. What does this mean? Now, if you suspect acute hepatitis, you must remember that when the patient is having features of acute hepatitis, the HCV antibody may be negative. The HCV antibody appears after a variable period of 2 to 12 weeks, usually after more than 8 weeks of acute infection. So during acute infection, if you suspect acute HCV infection, you should always ask for an HCV RNA. And in severely immunocompromised patients, the HCV antibody may be falsely negative, but the incidence is very, very low. Evaluation for HCV infection, just as we have evaluated for a patient with chronic hepatitis B or a patient with chronic liver disease, we should evaluate for a patient with chronic HCV infection in a similar manner by taking the history, physical examination, look at the LFT, prothrombin time, hemogram, abdominal ultrasound, endoscopy, just as we have discussed before. And we should do an HCV RNA quantitative assay, which is available in our program. When should we start treatment for HCV? Now, this is not that complicated. So we have got basically either acute hepatitis or chronic hepatitis. Acute hepatitis C is rarely diagnosed. Most of the time it passes off undiagnosed. But if you diagnose acute hepatitis C, most will wait for a period of 3 to 6 months, waiting, checking whether there is spontaneous clearance of the virus. If the HCV RNA persists beyond that, the patient will be given treatment for acute hepatitis C, just as in case of chronic hepatitis C. Now, in patients with chronic hepatitis C, look for the presence of HCV RNA. If the HCV RNA is detectable, the patient becomes a candidate for treatment of HCV. Always prioritize patients with significant fibrosis and HIV co-infection. So these are the drugs. Previously, we were using pegylated interferon with ribavirin, but nowadays we are not using that. We are using direct-acting antivirals, the DAS, and these DAS have actually revolutionized the management of hepatitis C infection. Now, the different groups of these antiviral drugs are the NS3-4A or the protease inhibitors, the NS5A inhibitors, the NS5B polymerase inhibitors, which may be nucleotide analog or the nucleoside analog. Now, you need to remember these drugs. The protease inhibitors are cimeprevir, paritaprevir, telaprevir, boceprevir, sovaprevir, asunaprevir, voxilaprevir. Telaprevir and boceprevir are the old generation drugs not used nowadays. The NS5 inhibitors are the daclatasvir, velpatasvir, ledipasvir, ombitasvir, pibrentasvir, elvasvir. The NS5B polymerase nucleotide analog is the sofosbuvir, and the non-nucleoside analog is the dasabuvir. Among these drugs, sofosbuvir, velpatasvir, and daclatasvir are available in our program. Now, this hepatitis C has got 7 genotypes, and some of these drugs are genotype specific. That means they are active against only a specific genotypes, and some of these drugs are pan-genotypic. That means they are active against all genotypes. In our hepatitis control program, we are using only pan-genotypic drugs, sofosbuvir, daclatasvir, and velpatasvir. Now, regarding the anti-HCV treatment regimens, we divide our patients into 2 groups, whether the patient is having cirrhosis or not. And if the patient is having cirrhosis, then we subgroup them into whether they have got decompensated cirrhosis or compensated cirrhosis. So we have got 3 sets of patients without cirrhosis, patients with cirrhosis but compensated, that is child PUG A, and patients with cirrhosis who are decompensated, child PUG B and C. In patients without cirrhosis, uncomplicated patients, we give sofosbuvir plus daclatasvir for 12 weeks. This is according to our national program. Patients who have got compensated cirrhosis, we give them sofosbuvir or velpatasvir for 12 weeks. Patients who are decompensated, we give them sofosbuvir, velpatasvir and ribavirin for 12 weeks, or in ribavirin intolerant patients, we give them sofosbuvir, velpatasvir for 24 weeks. But ribavirin has got some adverse effects, some drawbacks. So most usually prefer to use sofosbuvir and velpatasvir for 24 weeks in this population. What are the advantages and disadvantages of these drugs? These drugs are very potent drugs. They have got high SVR or sustained virological remission. That means SVR 12 means that 12 weeks after completion of the treatment, the HCV RNA is undetectable. So these drugs have an SVR 12 of 90% or more. Sustained virological response 90% or more, SVR 12. They have high response rate across the genotypes. We are using pan-genotypic regimen in our program. They can be used in decompensated liver disease. This is very important. Interferon cannot be used in decompensated liver disease. They are well tolerated. They are very well tolerated, hardly produce any serious side effects. What we are using in our program are pan-genotypic, and they do not require much monitoring. Cost, availability, accessibility was a problem in the past, but now they are available in our program. The program is becoming more and more accessible to our patients. Drug interaction is always a problem. Whenever we are treating HIV infected patient, drug interaction is always a concern. HBV reactivation may occur in hepatitis B, HCV co-infected patients who are given treatment for HCV. So have to give hepatitis B treatment as well, which is not a problem in our program because we are already using anti-hepatitis B drugs in our ART regimen. Drug interactions are always very, very important, and certain drug interactions we definitely have to remember. The drug interactions about which we are most concerned is when you are using efavirenz based regimen. Remember that daclatasvir dose instead of 60 milligram has to be increased to 90 milligram. And if you are using an boosted atazanavir, ritonavir boosted ATV, atazanavir based regimen, then the dose of daclatasvir has to be reduced to 30 milligram. And it is advisable to first initiate treatment for HIV and HIV suppression before starting HCV treatment, although there are some circumstances where it may make sense to treat HCV infection first and then initiate therapy for HIV. So if the patient is very much immunosuppressed, it is always better you start the antiretroviral therapy first and then you start the hepatitis therapy for hepatitis C virus. However, there may be situations. I'll give you one example. We had one patient, at that time we are using tenofovir, lamivudine and efavirenz, and you see that efavirenz has got important interaction with daclatasvir. It was difficult to give a 90 milligram because only 60 milligram tablets were available. That patient has got a very high CD4 count. It was an IDU. So what we did that we first gave the hepatitis treatment for hepatitis C, completed the treatment for hepatitis C. Patient has a high CD4 count, so that was immunosuppression was not a big problem. So we treated the hepatitis C first, and then we started the antiretroviral therapy. So basically we have to individualize, but most of the time you start the treatment for HIV and then you start the treatment for HCV. Keeping in mind the drug interaction, keeping in mind the problem of drug toxicity. Now, sofosbuvir and velpatasvir should not be used with efavirenz. Again, nevirapine we are not using. So this is another important point that you must remember. Sofosbuvir, velpatasvir should not be used with TDF if eGFR is less than 60. And ribavirin should not be used in zidovudine, diadenosine or stavudine. These again, diadenosine, stavudine we are not using. For drug interaction, you can always check these sites. This is a very good site. The Liverpool website is very, very good for checking the drug interactions. Now, ART initiation and monitoring, the decision to start ART among co-infected HCV should follow the same principles as for HIV monoinfection. The ARV regimen remains the same: tenofovir, lamivudine, dolutegravir. Potential harmful effects of antiretroviral drugs include their hepatotoxic effects. There are some concern about dolutegravir in patients with hepatitis B, hepatitis C infection. Regular monitoring of liver and renal function is required when using the DAS and ARV drugs together. This is very, very important. Regularly monitor the transaminases, creatinine. Rule out hepatitis B infection prior to DA therapy. Counsel the patient. Avoidance of alcohol is very much important. Alcohol, hepatitis C, very bad combination. And regarding sharing of needle and syringes, use appropriate precautions to prevent transmission during pregnancy. Avoiding pregnancy during treatment. These drugs are not used during pregnancy. Administer hepatitis A and B vaccine in susceptible populations. In any patient who has underlying liver disease, if he is not immune to hepatitis and hepatitis B, always give the vaccine. No effective HCV vaccine and PMTCT protocol. Prevention of HCV infection among the IDUs is very important. Strict maintenance of disposal of needles, syringe, sharps, etc. in healthcare settings, biomedical waste disposal. So to summarize, all HIV infected patients should be evaluated for hepatitis B and HCV co-infection. In hepatitis B co-infection, initial regimen should include potent drugs, at least 2 drugs which are active against hepatitis B virus. The DAS have revolutionized HCV treatment. Hepatitis B virus infection to be ruled out prior to HCV DAA therapy. Prevention of hepatitis B HCV co-infection in HIV is very, very important. Post-exposure prophylaxis is important for hepatitis B virus prevention to mother-to-child transmission. Always take care of drug interactions and drug toxicities. Now, this is the national guidelines for diagnosis of management of viral hepatitis. I would request all of you to go through this guideline. It's very lucidly written and it is very, very informative. And this is actually the guideline that we are following. Just like NACO directs our ART protocol, this guidelines directs what we should be using for treatment of hepatitis B and hepatitis C infection. Thank you. And finally, I would like to acknowledge the help that I got from Dr. S.K. Guha, who is the program director of School of Tropical Medicine, which is also the Center of Excellence. He has allowed me to share his slides for this presentation. Thank you again. So if we have questions, you can unmute yourself and I think we can take the questions.
Yes, if anyone has any queries, you can unmute yourself and you can ask, please.
If you have not understood anything at any point, you can ask me. If you have not understood anything, the difficulty in understanding at any point of time.
Sir, I think before student, I have my one query.
Yes,
First
sir.
query is like this. If somebody is having either hepatitis B or hepatitis C infection, does it the severity of the disease is depending upon the amount of CD4 cell count of an individual or a patient? This is the queries, and if gradually if the number is decreasing, then how these symptoms, appearance, and other manifestations of the hepatitis B or hepatitis C may occur. Second is, suppose if we are having hepatitis B and hepatitis C both means coexistence along with the HIV, then in such case, whether our medicine given for ART means that is going to be revised or it is going to be same as it is, like without HIV and without hepatitis B and C coexistent of the disease.
Now let me take the second question first. We have got a patient with Hep B, Hep C, both co-infected with HIV.
Yes,
correct?
yes, yes.
Okay, no. So what happens is that usually when we have got hepatitis B and hepatitis C both together, and the patient has got a liver disease, the driving infection is usually the hepatitis C. Okay, but as I've said before, that if the patient needs treatment for hepatitis C, and if the patient has got an underlying hepatitis B infection, if you start treatment with hepatitis C, then there is a chance of flare of the hepatitis B infection. So B infection has to be treated as well. So most of the time what we do is that we start the antiretroviral therapy, and the antiretroviral therapy takes care of the hepatitis B infection as well. So we start the antiretroviral therapy, it will take care of the hepatitis B, and then we'll start the hepatitis treatment for hepatitis C as well. So there is not need for much change in the ART regimen or the HCV treatment regimen. HCV
Thank you, sir. Thank you.
remains the same, and but for this tenofovir lamivudine dolutegravir will be using as our ART regimen. But again, we have to remember that there is always a more chance of flare. So you have to be very much careful whether the patient is developing hepatitis or not. And regarding the first question, the more the immunosuppressed is the patient, there is the more chance of for the deterioration of the liver function and progression of the disease. In
Yeah,
this
thank you.
patient, there is less chance of seroconversion from hepatitis B E antigen to hepatitis B E antibody. The HBV DNA level also be increased.
Thank you, sir. Thank you very much. I think this is a very exhaustive and very good presentation from your side. I hope all students they understood it very nicely, very clearly. And here we'll stop the recording, and we'll upload it